Welcome everybody, welcome back, or welcome to Immersed if this is your first time. Coming to you live from the Immersion Lab inside of MIT.nano. The Immersion Lab is, like the rest of MIT.nano, is a central and shared facility for the community, for MIT researchers, students, faculty, guests, visitors, partners, and for the external world to come in and enable the research, enable the science, enable the art, the benefits from motion capture, from wireless physiological monitoring, from the technologies of gaming. So we have our monthly series, and that's what I'm here to introduce today. My name is Brian Anthony. I'm the Associate Director of MIT.nano. Today, for Immersed In, it's Immersed in Markerless Tracking. We're going to be joined by Jessica Rosendorf, a Graduate Fellow in Mechanical Engineering, and Ritaank Tiwari in WCS, sharing their work on markerless tracking. Ask lots of questions as we go. We'll answer them live. We'll have time for Q&A afterwards. And this is the start of a 3-sequence series highlighting the students that are benefiting and using the Immersion Lab for their graduate research, for their undergraduate research. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jess, who's going to sort of slide in here as I go off stage. I won't ask you to sing, and I won't ask you to say the alphabet backwards, but Jess, take it away.
Thanks. So hi everyone, I'm Jess, and I'll be presenting some of my work with markerless tracking that I've been doing in the Immersion Lab. So we'll start out here with some videos. So these are both examples of motion capture. The video on the left was recorded in the lab. The subject is wearing infrared markers and is being tracked by 30+ cameras. And here we can see the trajectory of the point on his wrist as he throws the baseball. And in the video on the right, we have the same person throwing a baseball, but he's out in the field at practice like he is almost every day. And above the two videos, we can see the path of the point on his wrist as well. And we can see clearly the trajectory in both, although the one out in the field is definitely noisier, which leads me into my first point. Something that I want to get out of my research here is to be able to record athletes' natural movements and track how they change over time with different training protocols through injury, things like that. And so my goal is to be able to track athletes out in the field with the same accuracy level as we can get in the lab with the high-end technology that we have here. And another advantage is that in the field, there's no setup time. In the lab, it takes up to an hour or more to place all the markers on participants. So if we wanted to track someone every day as they're progressing through a rehabilitation or a new training protocol, it's a lot to ask them to come into the lab and train that and set that up every day. Also, movement gets impeded by the presence of markers and the smaller space in the lab versus if we can record people in their everyday life, we'll be able to see a more realistic picture of what their movement actually looks like. So to start out, I will walk you through the markerless tracking workflow that I've been developing and working on in my time here so far. Essentially, the way it works is you record videos on 2 or more cameras, and then use point tracking algorithms in both those videos and combine the 2D coordinates you can get from both videos in combination with camera calibration parameters to get a 3D coordinate. So the first step is positioning the cameras. Initially, when I started working on this, I thought that the cameras would be positioned at the front and the back of the participant. But actually, you want to put the cameras on the same side of the person so that you can see the same point in both videos at all times. The other consideration here is that the goal is to triangulate points in 3D. So we need the angle between the cameras to be big enough to actually be able to triangulate. So positioning cameras is really about finding the sweet spot between the cameras being too close together that the triangulation doesn't work as well, and the cameras being too far apart that you are unable to see the same point in both videos. So as I explain the workflow, I'll be using some capture I did with the baseball team as an example. So here we have the cameras on the sides of the image here, and we can see the batter. And we needed the nets for protection, so we didn't get hit by any rogue balls. So the next step is to record videos. But before that, we need to record calibration frames. And I'll explain more about what we do with these later on. But what you need to know at this point is that you want to move this checkerboard around the field of view of the camera. And we'll use that later on. And then next, you can record the actual movements that you're interested in tracking. So here we have someone swinging a baseball bat. And the key here is to make sure that the cameras are perfectly synchronized. So in order for the triangulation to work, you need to be actually tracking the same point and at the same time. So that's a real challenge that we encountered, is figuring out the best way to make sure the cameras are perfectly synchronized, but also still capturing at a fast enough frame rate to be able to see everything we're interested in seeing. So here, these are two camera views perfectly synchronized, yeah. Next, you want to extract 2D coordinates from each of the videos. So in order to do that, I have been using Deep Lab Cut, which is a neural network that was designed for tracking points on the skin of animals. So here I've trained this model on the human and also added points on the baseball bat because I was interested in tracking that as well. They have an existing human model that you can download from the internet, and it might need to be refined depending on lighting conditions and things like that. For example, here I had to retrain the model a bit because the hat confused the forehead position. But once you train the model, the advantage of this is that if you train it well on a diverse data set, it can be applied to a variety of videos without requiring retraining. And I labeled about 20 frames per video in the training. So it's not a ton of labeling, which is nice. So next, you want to extract your calibration parameters. The first step in this is actually extracting frames from the calibration video that you recorded, because the algorithm runs on images, not videos. And the key here is to make sure you extract the same frame from both videos. And then also just make sure that you can see the checkerboard in both images clearly. And then I've been working with the MATLAB stereo camera calibration toolbox, which uses image processing to identify the location of the checkerboard in space in both the images. And then because a checkerboard has a very strict structure to it, and you tell the algorithm the size of each box of the checkerboard, the algorithm is able to use that information to deduce the location of the cameras relative to each other, and also any distortion caused by the lenses of the cameras. And then afterwards, it will show you each of the images and where it found the checkerboard, and it will give you a mean error estimate, which you can see down here. So you can sort of make sure that it's actually working. And then it will also give you this map. So here is where the algorithm predicts the two cameras are located. And then here it shows you where the images were taken. And if you remember from the video before, that lines up pretty well with the way that the checkerboard was being moved. So this is a nice sanity check to make sure that the algorithm is actually working the way you expect it to. So now that we have collected all of the ingredients that we need in the 2D coordinates and the calibration parameters, we can combine them all together to see points in 3D. So here is the same video again, and the line on top is the trace of the point at the tip of the bat, or the end of the bat, as it moves through 3D space. And we can see it's definitely a bit noisy, but the overall trajectory is definitely being captured. And then just some more examples that are easier to see. So here's just a snippet of the baseball player sort of moving the bat around behind his shoulder before he swings. And so we can see clearly here the movement of the bat, and his joints down here aren't moving a ton. And then in this snippet is the actual swing. So we can see a lot more movement here, and clearly each of the points on the bat and his knees and ankles moving as well. So now I'll talk a little bit about validation and some hardware recommendations, because this is all great, but how well is it actually working is important to know. So when I first started working on this project, we were using ELP cameras, which are USB software triggered cameras. They require manual synchronization, which means I had to write a code that would make sure that each frame was only recorded if frames were captured from both cameras. And this can result in inconsistent frame rates and also inconsistent exposure times, which will introduce more noise in the 3D coordinates that are extracted. For example, the baseball videos that I have been showing you were recorded with these cameras, and the code was designed to capture data at 120 frames per second. And we ended up with an average of about 70 frames per second, but that was pretty inconsistent, and we had to do a lot of post-processing to normalize that. These are also the cheapest cameras, which is something to consider. But again, you get lower quality videos and more noise in your data. The cameras I am working with currently are the Sony RX02. And these have an Ethernet connection to the computer and have automatic synchronization and are hardware triggered. So that means that the frame rate and the exposure time is much more controlled and consistent. And so with these cameras, we can get guaranteed 120 frames per second completely synchronized. And they can actually capture up to 960 frames per second, but the synchronization at that frame rate sort of fails a bit. But work down the road will be to try to synchronize these cameras at higher frame rates. And frame rate is important because in a lot of sports movements, such as pitching, or we do a lot of work with fencing in the immersion lab. So the tip of a fencing sword moves very quickly. So to be able to track that, you need a high frame rate. And these cameras are more expensive. They're $650 each. And then for the synchronization, they require a control box as well, which is another $650. But here, again, you get higher quality and less noise in your data. And lastly, we have the OptiTrack color cameras. So OptiTrack is the company that makes the marker-based tracking system that we have here in the immersion lab. So they have a lot of documentation. It's a very commercial product that they sell. So the advantage of the OptiTrack color cameras is that it works directly with Motive, which is the OptiTrack software. So the synchronization and a lot of the data organization is done automatically for you. Again, similar to the Sony cameras, these are an Ethernet connection and have automatic synchronization. And these can get up to 250 frames per second. But these cameras are more expensive. They can be up to $1,650 each, and then also require the Motive license to operate them and take advantage of that software. But here you get definitely high quality results. So one validation that we did was recording movement. This is Praneeth, who works in the immersion lab. So he put markers on his hand, and we recorded him moving his hand around from 3 different cameras all simultaneously. So at the top here, this is the recording from the ELP USB cameras. Down here, we have the OptiTrack color cameras, which are the Ethernet ones that are connected to the OptiTrack system. And then here we have a video recorded from the OptiTrack infrared cameras, which we used as ground truth. So here's just what he was doing. He was just moving his hand around in space. And so after this experiment, we compared the trajectories determined by each of the cameras. So here on the left, we see the result from the ELP USB camera. In the middle is the OptiTrack color, and on the right is the ground truth, which was the infrared marker-based tracking. And then just as another perspective over here, we have one marker trace from each of the 3 cameras overlaid on top of each other. So the blue is the ground truth, the white is the USB camera, and the pink is the OptiTrack color camera. And so we can see that all of the cameras were able to recover the trajectory of the his hand movements, but there's definitely more noise in the markerless tracking. And especially in the ELP, we can see a lot more wiggling in between frames, which is probably related to that frame rate issue I was talking about earlier. So to sort of orient us in the space of 3D tracking and visualization, we have point clouds, which is a lot of what I've been working with, and is the location of points in 3D space. And so the way I've been approaching finding point clouds is, as I mentioned, triangulation with point tracking in 2 or more cameras. And then skeletons is when you sort of connect each of these points in space, and then you have more of a body-like shape. And then a 3D mesh is actually like a 3-dimensional shape that's placed over these points and looks more like a human. And so in a minute, Ritaank is going to take over, and he'll be talking about some deep learning algorithms to extract each of the 3 of these from a single video, which might lead you to ask, why do we even bother working with 2 cameras? But the single video works by making a lot of assumptions based on the way humans are expected to move. And so although it looks really cool, it loses a lot of the accuracy of tracking the specific movement of the exact video that you're looking at. So with that, I'll hand it over to Ritaank.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ritaank. Thanks, Jess, for the kind introduction. So what we're going to be getting started on here, as you can see on this slide, we're kind of representing the same data in multiple different ways. So with a markerless tracking or a marker tracking approach, you are going to get some kind of a point cloud data, a 3D representation of the data that you're trying to capture. And there are a lot of things that can be done with this data to visualize it, to process it, and to create a body model from it. So we're going to start here by taking a look at, if I have a skeleton, how can I get a 3D mesh from that skeleton? And to be clear here, what a skeleton means is not only do we have these points, points in our point cloud, but we also know the connections of these points that create a rigged body model that actually represent the human's limbs and are all connected to each other. In addition to that, we also know, we also have the points are also labeled, which means we know where the point is through time. In an unlabeled, if I'm just capturing motion capture, with passive markers, it's not instantly clear which, when I'm recording all these frames, it's not instantaneously clear that a point is consistent through time. Oh, this point was here in this frame and moved to here in this next frame. We don't actually have that data because it's just a passive reflector. So a skeleton represents the fact that these markers are labeled and that we actually have a rigid body model from them. So once we have that, the question is, well, how can we render a realistic 3D mesh from that skeleton? And I'm going to point here to the SMPL. It's pronounced simple, skin multi-person linear model. And it's a human body model that's come out of the Max Planck Institute for Intelligent Systems. And it's one of the most common and popular body models used in these kinds of motion capture and biomechanics workflows. And there are a couple of reasons why, and we're going to see those reasons throughout in the next couple of minutes. But the thing to know on this slide is basically once you have that skeleton, as I was saying, you can actually render a mesh. Okay, so let's get into this a little bit more. So the first question that you might have is, well, to take a rigged body model and render it, there are already many ways to do that. You know, and anyone familiar with animation will know that through linear blend skinning and through a lot of very well used and well-known ways, you can take a skeleton and actually say, okay, if I have some bones here, I know to fit the mesh of the person kind of around those bones, and as the skeleton moves, I just kind of move the mesh accordingly. Linear blend skinning, or LBS, is a really common approach for this, and the key insight used here, used in this approach, is actually an idea called blend weights, where for each vertex on the mesh, that vertex is going to have has a relationship with each of the bones in the person's body, and the blend weights that I'm referring to refer to basically a vector of weights relating a vertex to every bone. And that relationship means that when that bone moves, or how, like basically when I'm trying to place that vertex, which bones matter the most. So obviously a vertex out on my forearm right here is going to have a really high blend weight relationship with this kind of, you know, bone in my rigid body, and it's going to have a very low, in fact, zero relationship to my leg. And so with a simple blend weight model, and you can actually calculate these initial blend weights from a starting pose by saying, okay, I have a vertex in this location. I can, you know, you can sum up over all of the bones and actually, you know, get your initial blend weights. I'm not going to dive too much into it. So the question here is, so there's many ways to do this. So why this body model, and what are the strengths to it? So we can see in this image right here that there are, in the circled areas, you'll find that there are a lot of inconsistencies and actually unrealistic parts of the rendering that happen in these kind of overly simplistic and standardized approaches. And in the simple body model, a lot of these are actually ironed out and fixed. And it's because of a couple of unique approaches and unique innovations used in the simple body model that enables this. And it's why it's become so popular and why it's so widely used in these motion capture and you know, human body workflows. So I'll start at a high level, and if there are questions, please do ask, and I'm happy to go into details as needed. But essentially, the key insight here is that in the simple body model, we're actually, the first thing is it's a factored body model. So it factors out the parameters for pose, shape, and other factors that can be added in and are added in future iterations of the simple body model, including soft tissue deformations, and including the fact that the body actually moves and the body changes as one breathes. So all of those things can be factored in. And so it's actually an additive model. So each of these factors, the parameters and weights and relevant parts can be calculated and added in as needed to basically just render a better and better mesh. But the simplest formulation starts with pose and shape. So one insight here is that with a pre-trained simple body model, there's actually kind of three key pre-trained ones: a male body, a female body, and a neutral body. What's the kind of key thing here that I want to point out is that for any person's unique body type, we can actually take our template bodies. I just mentioned a template male, template female, and template gender neutral kind of body model. We can take that template body, and with 10 key parameters, we can actually tune that template body to approximately fit whatever unique body our subject has. So this actually creates rendered meshes that are accurate to the subject's own proportions, to their dimensions, to their height, to their weight, etc. And this also makes it fast to render because there's a pre-trained model which is creating a relationship between a skeleton and a mesh. And then there are these parameters that can be tuned that also are plugged into the model when we're trying to generate that mesh. And so there are more parameters, actually. You know, it's not that there are only 10. There are more parameters, but in the studies of this model, with 10 parameters, you can actually get a very, very close approximation to the actual body model that you're trying to render. And these top 10 were actually, the number 10 was kind of selected through a PCA process, principal component analysis, to those who are familiar. I'm happy to go into that if needed. So just to take us one step back, the goal is to render an accurate mesh for a skeleton. And what I've just said is that no matter what our subject is, you know, no matter who our subject is, no matter what their proportions are, we can actually solve for and input these parameters into our body model to render an accurate mesh for that person. The other thing I mentioned was because it's an additive model, depending on how accurate and what parts, you know, what aspects that you would like to be rendered, you can add those features in. And I'm not going to go through all of those, but you know, when you research this body model, you'll find there are ways to add hand tracking, there are ways to add face tracking, there are ways to add soft tissue deformations, as I said. So it's additive. And these are the strengths of Simple that make it fast, accurate, and fit in to a great motion capture workflow. So now I've said, so now to kind of go back to this diagram here, our guiding diagram. Look, we from a skeleton, we can create a 3D mesh. In fact, that's almost one-to-one. If I have a skeleton in a simple body model, the 3D mesh is a given. It's fast to render. But how do we get that skeleton? So from a point cloud, how we get that skeleton, one kind of innovative approach that fits into this simple body model process is Mosh++, which stands for motion and shape capture from and sparse markers. So I think before I say anything about this, I'd just like to show you something. So those 10 kind of key parameters that I was mentioning earlier in the simple body model, these are referred to as the beta parameters. And the beta parameters, again, help parameterize, help take you from a template body model to a specific body model that matches and closely matches a specific subject. So in the motion process, if I have a labeled motion capture data, the process first fixes the frame and solves for the beta parameters. So what this means is I have a motion capture. I have some motion capture data. I have many frames of it. And the first step is I'll pick one frame that has low occlusions and is kind of clear, like a T-pose. We love T-poses. And I can take that T-pose, I drop in, and this is a visualization of step-by-step of this motion process. I literally just drop in my template body model. In this case, it's the template male body model. And then I'm going to, using an alignment loss, I'm going to iteratively update so that my template model matches the actual pose that is kind of being represented by this frame. And because each of these points are labeled, And because from my mesh, I know where the labeled points belong. And this is something that I guess I'm going to gloss over a little bit because I know where these labeled points belong. I can just kind of match, and I'm looking to optimize an alignment loss, and I can calculate my beta parameters, how tall this individual is, you know, their ratio of their ligaments, etc. So that's step one here. And I'll just show it again and shut up for a second. Right. And then the second step is now once I have these beta parameters, I basically have a parameterized model of this subject's body. And frame by frame now, I can just fit this model to the data that I have. And what you're seeing is the render kind of mesh, but what you should understand is the mesh and the skeleton are almost a one-to-one, matching. So this mesh is representing the skeleton beneath. So, but this process still requires labeled markers. So now, very, very quickly, I'm going to actually highlight a really innovative solution to taking an unlabeled motion capture where I just have point clouds through time and being able to actually label these points based on what makes sense for a constrained human body. And this process comes out of the same lab's research, and it's called SOMA, which is solving optical marker-based mocaps automatically, which can take unlabeled motion capture data and be able to align so that through every frame, the same point, we actually know where it moves through time, which the word to you describe that is called a tracklet. I'm able to track a point through time and then also label it with the appropriate name for what part of the human body that marker was attached to. I'm happy to talk about this training process more. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. But just this exists. So it's possible to take an unlabeled motion capture, label it, then take that label, run Bosch on it to get an SMPL body model skeleton with our betas, and then I can render it as needed. So we've kind of seen here from a raw motion capture, we can generate accurate skeletons and meshes with realistic deformations. Okay. But to connect back into what Jess started with, what about markerless tracking workflows? So here we don't start with the point cloud. So before I go to the next slide, one option here is to use a markerless tracking workflow to generate this point cloud and then move forward. Another option is, and this is a bit of an old paper now, there are some improvements on it, but it was seminal at its time, is VIBE, Video Inference for Human Body Pose and Shape Estimation, which uses self-attention and adversarial training. And the adversarial training is basically this model tries to take from a video, monocular video, generate and render a mesh, and it's trying to fool an agent that this rendered mesh is actually real and not synthesized because it's synthesized. So that's kind of an adversarial training setup where you have a discriminator and you are trying to fool the discriminator so that the discriminator does not know whether the mesh, the rendering you're providing it is synthesized from an image or is an actual, piece of ground truth training thing. All right. And so instead of talking more about this now, I'd just like to show you for this baseball swing. And these are both of the camera's feeds, and the VIBE was run individually because obviously it doesn't have the ability to take in both cameras together for depth. It just uses monocular video. And so I'm going to play these. And so the mesh is placed right on top of the body. Let it swing. Good swing. I don't play baseball at all, but looks good. All right. And then here is that same swing in Blender. And just full disclosure. See, of course, because this is coming straight from video, there is jitter, there are inaccuracies. The hands aren't being tracked here. It's just the body, so the hands are always open. And this has gone through no post-processing or smoothing. And just for the record, for these kinds of markerless tracking approaches, there are newer models that show significant improvements over Vibe. Vibe is just a very easy to use one to get started in this space. And the last thing I want to mention is that in many cases, it's useful to do 2D skeleton tracking. 2D skeleton tracking to basically in kind of convolutional workflows, or to just basically extract some data from the image. If you want to see a hand motion someone's making or a body pose someone's making, you don't need to go into 3D. A lot of this data can be extracted in 2D. So this is using HRNet, high ResNet, which is a 2D skeleton tracking approach. If you'd like to learn more about it, you feel free to ask. Otherwise, I won't dive into that without any interest. But these do exist, and they are pretty good. I should play this too. So it's using a top-down approach where there's actually two models being run simultaneously. First, the bounding box is actually being detected by Coco. So detecting here's a person, and here's a bounding box around the person in this video. And then from that bounding box is passed in to HRNet to actually put a skeleton over that individual. And even though some of the points are occluded as the batter completes the swing and the arm goes behind, we can actually see there's some consistency through there in swing. And here are some references. I gracefully used a lot of graphics from other research. I'm thankful for these references. And I would personally like to thank Praneeth, who is my advisor through my research here at the Immersion Lab, and Brian for being my research sponsor. It's been a great, last year at the Immersion Lab, and I just want to thank both of these.
I would also like to thank Praneeth and Talis as well in the Immersion Lab, and Brian, who's my advisor. And also shout out to Todd, who is the MIT baseball coach.
Thank you, Jess and Ritaank. Let me get into frame.
Sure.
Okay, so that's good if we walk back a little bit. So if anybody has questions, please feel free to type in the chat. We'll start off the discussion with some comments from you, Ritaank, on can you talk about how much computationally intensive some of these 3D rendering pipelines are, and which part takes the most time?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the part that is definitely going to take the most time is running the MOSH algorithm. The creators of that algorithm actually, and to not dive in too much into the weeds, their implementation, they note it as it can be made faster, but they have some basic code that they used, and it actually can be very slow. I'll just give some brief times here. That the first phase that I mentioned of motion, where you're actually solving for the betas, it's one frame and you're fitting the model into the betas. That can take around 30 to 40 minutes on a pretty powerful PC. And it's all CPU based only. This motion step, there's no GPU involved. And the second stage of fitting to each frame takes about 2 seconds a frame. The other parts of this pipeline can be greatly benefited and sped up with a good GPU. So that would radically depend on what kind of GPU you have. Yeah.
Okay. And a quick follow-up to that. Can you talk a little bit about what is it possible? And if it is possible, it's probably possible. How would you make these real time? What would you have to do, either hardware or software wise, to make the rendering real time?
Oh, so you're saying if I have a person, and you're saying to render a mesh real time from the whole process.
Yeah.
So there would definitely be some setup there involved, which is that if I can pre-solve the beta parameters for that individual, right, then I'm already really set, because then all I can do is I have to take the person's markers, and there are ways actually to fix those labels to those markers. So then I start with the labeled marker set, and all I have to do is actually solve for the skeleton and then render it. And so every you can factor out all of the parts of that pipeline that can be done before, and that would be all that's left. Now, as far for how much latency there would be in a live rendering, I wouldn't know. I think that's setup dependent. I think it would definitely be some latency to render a mesh live on a person. Yeah, but there is some cutting edge stuff coming out now that is trying to do that for sure. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Jess, next question's for you. What are you going to do with your markerless tracking applications?
So a lot of the work that I'm doing for my thesis is related to tracking injuries in athletes, as well as finding efficient movement patterns and ways to improve people's efficiency. And so right now I'm working with infrared marker-based tracking data, but long term, the goal is to be able to combine the work I've been doing with that with markerless tracking, so that I can, as I mentioned, just like record athletes in the weight room at practice every day and be able to track their progression over time.
Cool. And where do you see these applications going, Ritaank?
So that is a broad question. It's a good question. That definitely that I see that as this pipeline improves, the ability to record motion captured data and have it instantly highly usable, I can see that definitely being a huge accomplishment in the space. I mean, in my time here, I've come to understand that data collection is just the first step in a long process to actually being able to get inferences and insights into what's happening. And I think with a good pipeline like this, you can actually get to that end goal a lot faster. And even with that simple body model, you can actually even generate motion, which is something that I'm working on. Yeah.
Cool. So maybe this question is for both of you. For applications such as rehabilitation, physiotherapy, what more needs to be done? Is the tech already there and not being used, or is something missing that needs to be created before it can be used there? What do you see as the hurdles? Some of them can be technical, some of them can be non-technical. Feel free to elaborate your thoughts on all of these.
For me, I think the biggest hurdle right now is, I guess, sort of the accuracy, but also the resolution of markerless tracking. For example, the data that I've been working with the marker-based tracking, I'm looking at differences on the scale of millimeters, and being able to extract measurements that accurate from markerless tracking. I think we're a bit far from that. That being said, I think there's a way around that in training deep learning models to directly extract some of the parameters that I'm looking for, instead of calculating them based on measurements of deformations from tracking points on the skin.
Cool. Anything to add?
Yeah, I am Mike. Yeah, I would just say, yeah, I totally agree with Jess. I think there is a bit of a gap. So like, even assuming that you can, let's say you have a great markerless tracking workflow, accurate, high quality. I think the gap between having that data and being able to use it is there is a bit of a gray area there, because to use it, you need to have someone that can first interpret the data, and then also the queries that you're trying to do onto that data need to be able to be done in a useful way, so that you can actually give useful feedback to an athlete, to a person that can help I think that line isn't so clear. Hey, I have all these numbers. Am I telling someone something they already know, or am I being useful? Yeah.
You're making the argument for collaborating with experts who actually do this in real life.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Great. Okay, so we have a question from Bruce Allen Hecht. Thank you for the description and presentations. And the question is, are there libraries of data sets? How might it be useful? How might it be helpful to exchange data sets for these types of programs? I assume programs means software in this context.
I guess my interpretation of that would be related to the use of deep lab cut for the 2D point extraction. And I think I briefly mentioned that they have an existing human model, and that's based on a large collection of pre-trained data that's been collected on the internet and is available. So in that case, yes, I think it's very helpful to train more robust tracking models. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just add, I'll just make a comment. So there are a lot of data sets out there. I think the main lack currently is one of standardization. It is not straightforward how to look at motion, right? And then everybody has their lens, all of them being valid at the same time. And then the technology is slowly inching towards let's capture everything we can. And with the technology getting to a place where you can capture the most obvious things first, right? But if you're looking for something more subtle, you need better tech. So generating data sets is a crucial aspect for and doing some meta-analysis is crucial for the field to move forward. There have been some attempts in other fields to exchange big data sets. In the motion capture field, I don't know of one central location where all of this happens, but there are several websites where you can download many different data sets. The Immersion Lab, I'm plugging, is working on generating some very interesting and unique multimodal data sets on athletes and experts. And especially watch out for the third seminar in this series on dancing, where we are collecting a large data set from dancers. And if you know any dancers, please feel free to send them our way. I have another question. Do volumetric cameras give different data? If you're familiar with volumetric technology, feel free to answer the question.
Does that mean 360 cameras?
So the short answer is yes. So for instead of volumetric cameras, let's tackle something like Azure Connect. So the goal would be to extract actual points, not inferred, and reconstruct that, reconstruct the surface in 3D. So that's the problem of volumetric capture, right? So now you can do that with a lot of RGB cameras, and it's extremely computationally intensive. It's exactly like doing photogrammetry. That well, with one shot, we get a mesh that's I don't know, 120,000 polygons or sometimes millions, right? But it takes about 15 minutes to compute one frame. So now volumetric cameras, you can do it with photogrammetry technique if you can run the computation at 120 FPS, sure. You can also use something like depth cameras, like Azure Connect. You can combine a few of those to give you point clouds, and then you can infer a mesh from those point clouds. There's different ways of getting point clouds. Yeah. That's all I'm saying. Yeah. You can just do it with regular cameras or depth cameras. So this was Carl. Thank you for asking the question. I hope I sort of answered your question. Okay. Okay, great. So, folks, if there's any last questions, let us know. If not, can you advance the slide, please? Our next seminar in this series is going to be on running, and Enya Ryu, a senior in mechanical engineering, will talk about some of the work she's been doing at the immersion lab related to running. And the one after that is going to be in May, related to dancing. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at immersion@mit.edu. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
See you next time.